hold you when I see your light. Dark star.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Hal Scarp, and if you've been here before, you recognize me from the past and hopefully for the future as well. I'm also the Vice President of the York Sunbury Historical Society. I'd like to welcome everybody to our 5th virtual presentation in Stanton Friedman Memorial Speaker Series. Our guest this evening is Chris Rutkowski. He's the author of Abductions and Aliens and the Canadian UFO Report. Chris is a Canadian science writer and educator with degrees in astronomy and education. Since the mid-70s, he's also been studying reports of UFOs and other unusual phenomena, including lake monsters, Sasquatch, and again, Bigfoot is a continuing interest to many of us who also follow the UFO subject, the paranormal, and writing about his investigations, research in various media. His new book, Canada's UFOs Declassified, was done this year, and it details some of the most remarkable UFO cases investigated by the RCMP, the Royal Canadian Air Force, and the National Research Council of Canada. He has appeared on numerous radio programs, podcasts, and documentary TV series, including Unsolved Mysteries, UFO Hunters, Sightings, Eye to the Sky, Paracast, Discovery's Close Encounters, and NASA's Unexplained Mysteries, and A&E's The Unexplained, all very popular television programs, which I'm sure many of you have watched as well. He's a past president of both the Winnipeg Science Fiction Society and the Winnipeg Center of the Royal Astronomical Society of Canada. He's administrator of several UFO-related Facebook groups, including UFO Updates. It's a forum continuing the groundbreaking work of famed journalist Earl Knapp, which began in 1996. And he blogs about UFOs and related issues, and he publishes an annual study of UFO reports in Canada. Chris first met Stan in the 1970s during a public talk about UFOs at the University of Manitoba. That began a 30-year friendship, and despite the great distance between their homes, they managed to meet almost once a year to share information and develop a bond about their passionate interest in UFOs. Welcome to our viewers, Chris, and over to you.
Okay, thank you for that great introduction, Harold. So I don't have to tell you much about myself then. I've been at this for a while. I met Stan, as Harold mentioned, at the University of Manitoba. He was on one of his lecture tours. And, you know, that was an interesting time for me. I began investigating UFOs in the 70s. I was taking my astronomy degree, and all these phone calls kept coming into the astronomy department, and my profs, who were decidedly against UFOs, were being very annoyed by this. So I took it upon myself to try and get on their good graces by taking the phone calls for them. And that started me. I was hooked because I'm told that there was nothing to the UFOs at all. But the more I talked with people, the more I found that some of these cases were actually very curious. And Stan and another person whom I met about the same time, Alan Hynek, were both very integral to my appreciating the scientific understanding of UFOs, answering the questions, and UFOs as a scientific mystery was what I wanted to get at. Now I'll start sharing my screen here. Come on, there you go. And I've titled my talk, Stanton Friedman is Real. And I'll get to a description of this photo later. Can everybody see this okay? It's coming through okay? Okay. So yeah, this is Stan. As I first remember him, whether he was in my home or in a hotel room or on the road somewhere, he was always on the phone doing interviews. And that's how I remember Stan, because he had a passion that really was very demonstrable. So that was a trailer for the film Stanton Friedman is Real, which was produced by his nephew, Paul Kimball. Some of you may know Paul. And it came from the talk that Stan was always giving. This was typical of Stan's bookmarking and how people got to know him. This was the title of his talk because he wanted people to know that flying saucers were in fact real. And that was his tagline. And we got to know Stan through that. Now, what he was interested in, more than anything else, of course, were the UFO reports that kept coming in. And, you know, it's great that the Fredericton Region Museum is the repository for a lot of the artifacts that he collected along the way. There's a few other such collections, such funds across Canada. And I just want to give a little plug here that what you're looking at here is 1 year's worth of UFO reports in Canada. Each sheet that you see there, each piece of paper is one UFO report. And that's 1 year's worth because we have somewhere around 1,000 UFO reports in Canada every year. And as I produce the Canadian UFO survey, along with the cooperation and assistance of a number of people, including some who are on the screen here, thank you, Jan, and people like that. But the number of UFO reports has accumulated over the years, and over the past 32 years, there are more than 22,000 separate UFO reports that were in my files. And I was approached by the University of Manitoba to donate my files and collection and other materials to the university for posterity. And so I've been doing that. I did a lot of it before the pandemic locked everything down. And just recently, as things opened up again, I began loading up my car and taking over all my bins. And now the University of Manitoba has, I think, all my UFO reports from the past 30 some years. I'm working on the historical stuff as well, plus books and UFO zines and a lot of accompanying materials. There's two other interesting collections in Canada. One is the Arthur Bray collection at the University of Ottawa, and the John Musgrave collection, which actually MUFON has now, but for the longest time it was in Alberta. And very similar to what you are doing, the University of Manitoba Archives put on a display to tell the public about the collection. So this is one of the display cases that they produced, and it's more than just pieces of paper, many photographs. In fact, there's even you can see there in one of the cases, a torn undershirt from a classic case of Mr. Stefan Mihalik in 1967, who encountered a UFO just close to the Ontario border in Manitoba. He was burned by it. The case was investigated by the Canadian forces, is investigated by the RCMP. Even the United States Air Force itself came up to Manitoba to investigate. And what he saw was something like this. Classic saucer-shaped little door in the side, dome from which lights came out. And I have this thing. As a matter of fact, I received it yesterday. A fellow who has a 3D printer made a 3D model of this UFO that was seen at Falcon Lake in 1967 and gave it to me yesterday. So I thought I'd show it to you, but you can see in the slide down there, the model or the sketch that it's based on. And the book previous to the one that's just coming out now was titled When They Appeared. It's an in-depth study of this particular case. And that material has actually already been given to the archives. So it's fantastic that the Fredericton Museum is taking on Stan Friedman's papers. I have nowhere near as many as Stan, but it's a great way to preserve this other side of history, this alternate history, and a bit of our Canadian heritage that you don't usually hear about all that often. And I met Stan a number of times when he came to Winnipeg, but I'm one of the few people in ufology, I think, who actually went to visit Stan at his place. And this also comes from a TV show from, it's called Magnificent Obsessions. And part of this show involved visiting Stan in his home. And this is actually how it happened.
Hey, Stan. Astronomer Chris Rutkowski is not the only scientist devoted to solving this mystery.
Hey, don't blame it on me. I don't have anything to do with the guys upstairs.
Yeah.
Just the guys that come down.
Nuclear physicist Stanton Friedman shares Rutkowski's obsession with exposing the truth about UFOs.
And so there are three witnesses. Looked out the bedroom window, saw a hazy orange glow.
Rutkowski analyzes his data with Friedman, who's worked on many top-secret U.S. rocket programs and has been investigating UFOs for over 30 years.
Well, it's a code word, top secret code word.
Dubbed the flying saucer physicist, Friedman is an authority on government UFO files, the Roswell crash of 1947, and several famous UFO abduction cases.
I'm looking at the residue, the stuff that gets through after it's been looked at by competent investigators.
Well, there obviously are some secrets here when you see these whited out and blacked out documents. Can you read what's under the whiteout?
All UFO experiences are labeled as crazies, or they're imagining things. But these guys have never, ever gone out and done any solid investigation themselves, and not in the way that the Chris Rutkowskis and the Stan Friedmans and the Brian Vikes out on the West Coast have done.
So the fellow who was speaking there at the very end, that's Earl Bruce Knapp. And he was a very prominent figure in ufology. He passed a few years ago, and he ran UFO updates. I was asked by his family to take over UFO updates and turned it into the Facebook group that's working right now that I administer. And Stan was a frequent poster to that. A lot of the information that regarding cases and the Roswell crash was discussed in forums such as that, and we're trying to keep it, maintaining that as much as we can now. So that clip of me visiting in his home, so this entire film crew flew us out there, and this was when we visited him in his home. This is a photo, you've seen it a few times. Some of the presentations had this. This is the photo I took when we went down into his basement to see his, his stash. And there's a few other photos from that session that you probably haven't seen. This is another angle. You can see the film crews setting up, trying to figure out how do you capture this for everybody so we can understand what it was that it was really like. Here's another great view. And as was mentioned previously, he knew exactly where everything was. I mean, he could put his hands on any particular document. And this photo I like in particular because this is how Stan communicated with the world, his fax machine. And you can see his map so he could figure out where everything was and the time zones and so forth. But this shows you, this is the way that Stan got his message out and communicated with me and others for quite some time. And I threw this in because this is also something I just received just the other day. There's a fellow who runs a podcast named Jason Guillemette, and he's a big UFO fan. He's a bit of an artist, and he was reminiscing about Stan just the other day, and he quickly dashed off this sketch. And so Stan made such an impression on the UFO community, partly because he was literally traveling around the world talking about it, but because he was larger than life. And he really had such a passion that it imbued passion in other people, and it continues to this day. A couple other photos from the time we visited him for that particular TV show. And he was very gracious. Marilyn was very gracious as well. And what I wanted to convey during my talk, because everybody has covered a lot of the Roswell and some of the cases he worked on and so forth. I wanted to talk a little bit more about who Stan was that I knew, the Stan Friedman that I knew. Now, I mentioned the fax. This actually came through on a fax. I don't have much records in paper copy or even a digital copy from the 70s of my interactions with Stan that I could easily put up here. But this is from December 1984. And it was regarding one of his visits to Winnipeg. And, you may get a sense of how busy this fellow was. This was the travel itinerary for December 84. On December 15th, he left Fredericton at 11:45, arrived in Toronto 12:40, stayed there for a while, got to Winnipeg at 6:58. So, that's 7 hours or so on the road. Sunday, apparently he made contact with me the next day. And sometimes he came into town and would actually ditch his hotel room and ended up sleeping in a spare room at our place. But on Monday the 17th, he participated in an all-day by invitation only meeting at the University of Manitoba, arranged by Atomic Energy of Limited. The topic was use of seed stimulation with radiation in agriculture. The next day, Tuesday, went back home. This was not a UFO talk. He lectured widely on a number of other topics, and he had some very interesting ideas about using radioactivity to eliminate pests and so forth in agricultural products, so that we could, have safer foods. And there was an entire conference about that at the University of Manitoba that he was invited to speak at. So this was not about UFOs, but trust me, we talked about UFOs. And this was his business card back then. The Maritime Applied Science and Technology Limited, nuclear physicist and vice president and manager of applied science. I assume that there were not a lot of employees for this limited corporation, but you can see that his business card didn't mention UFOs, and he had other business cards, obviously, but this was a different side of Stan that not all of us got to see. So a few years later, 1987, the University of Manitoba put on a series of talks that were very approachable on a number of issues. This was one about space science, and you can see some interesting people. David Webb, chairman of the National Commission on Science, Frank Oberle, who was then Minister for State for Science, people from New York University, University of SoCal, law attorneys, and some astronauts. And Stan spoke twice at this particular event. The first one, Flying Saucers Are Real, that's listed down there, 8:30 p.m. But earlier in the day, he spoke on nuclear power. So he was diversified to the point where he could talk on nuclear power and UFOs. And yes, the UFO one was in the evening and got a lot more people. This is a correspondence I got from him, June 21st, 87. Same year, he just notes it's been very hectic with coming back from LA. He was doing some MUFON stuff. And at the very bottom, he noted, "Oh, I am booked to speak to the women's division of the Associated Canadian Clubs of Winnipeg on Monday. So we'll try to put together another tour out your way. Why do they always pick January?" Well, as was noted, Harold, it's pretty darn cold when you're running between Polo Park and everywhere else, and Stan was indeed suffering. But here he was speaking to a Canadian club of Winnipeg in January and wanted to put together another tour. So he's coming our way. Let's let's do some talks. In 1993, this is how he was interviewed by the university, one of the student newspapers. He was called the UFO Physicist. And this is one of the faxes I received a few years later, 1995. And he had actually come in, he wasn't brought in to speak to the University of Manitoba. He was actually brought in by the University of Winnipeg. But if you see in the handwritten part at the top, UMSU, that's the University of Manitoba Student Union, added a cheapie, hadn't got it, my faxes. So he talked them into hiring him to give a talk at the University of Manitoba as well, but he was speaking, he was very, very busy, dashing all over the place between here and Calgary. And in another handwritten note there, he talked to Fortean Times, thanks. I think I told the Fortean Times about something that he was doing, and they ended up being very, very agreeable to interview him. In 1987, there was an interesting way in which Stan and I worked together on a UFO case. And everybody's excited about pilots seeing UFOs these days. Well, back in 1987, as this note indicates, I was at the National Research Council in Ottawa, and I was going through the non-meteoric files of the NRC. That's where the UFO reports ended up going. And they had a teletype machine, and on that was constantly running, and UFO reports were being spat out from this thing. And while I was in the office, a teletype came in from a Canadian Airlines pilot reporting the tracking of a UFO on his plane's radar. Now, I tracked down who the person was with Canadian Airlines. He had been flying from Halifax to Toronto to Winnipeg. I couldn't get a hold of him directly, but he was based in Halifax. So I thought, well, you know, Stan's a little closer to there than I was, so I asked him if he could look into it. Then Stan's version of what was transpired came out in another one of his documents, and this I'm sure is going to be in your files. Chris Rutkowski, a friend, called May 26th to inform me he had noted an interesting but very brief report, radar observation, etc. So he called and he managed to talk to this pilot. Rick Olson, the pilot, was very cooperative, not defensive, but careful. Notice Stan was vetting him a little bit. This pilot had flown from Toronto to Halifax and was on his way from Toronto to Winnipeg. Radar was on because the flight was bumpy at 31,000 feet. The first officer noted a strong return on the radar at 50 miles, which is very unusual because the radar is designed to detect storms and not aircraft. And even jumbo jets would be fairly small. But this return was 5 to 6 times that expected from a 747, bright red in the middle with wings of green. Object was at approximately the same altitude, moving the same direction. He timed the sweep at once every 60 or so seconds. This move, therefore, was 9 miles per sweep, and it was translated into hundreds of miles. In each case, it was found to be moving 9 miles per 6 seconds, or 5,400 miles per hour relative to the plane. So this is what Stan found. And he talked with the pilot for quite some detail, ended up talking with a few others. And this resulted in a news story which was carried across Canada. This was a Canadian press story, Cosmic Watergate Uncovered in Documents. But the article actually starts out by describing how he talked with Rick Olson, and Rick Olson, the pilot's story, is in this article as well. So this was carried across Canada. People are all excited about mainstream media covering UFOs. And, you know, it's something new. Well, it's not new. 1987, this was carried by Canadian press, all newspapers across Canada. And it's very, very serious, was not making fun of anything, taking it very, very seriously. So this shows you that, you know, media have been very, very good in the past in a lot of situations. In 1990, I include this document because I remember from Chris Stiles' talk, and I see Chris is here today. Chris made some comment about how he didn't always agree with Stan, but you got along well with him in general. Well, Stan and I disagreed from time to time. This is a letter that I received May 28th, 1990, and it's sort of in general about talking about the Fund for UFO Research and doing some of his document investigations. And at the bottom of the letter, he said, "Good luck on Japan, arrow." And there's another arrow at the top as well, which meant there was something on the other side of the letter. And in fact, there was quite a lot. Chris, thanks for your letter. Your informant was correct. I was testy about the CBC show. And what had happened was we were both on CBC at the same time, and we seemed to be at cross purposes. The CBC story was really very basic, and I tried to steer it in one direction, and Stan had other thoughts. I had trouble that you, who know such a great deal about UFOs, could make the subject so trivial. You ask how to discuss the entire UFO issue during snippets. The answers are very straightforward. Surely your hostess, who, as with most, knew nothing. There's absolutely no need to discuss the entire issue. This would be like a sports reporter taking equal time to each strikeout as opposed to focusing on the home runs and special plays of the game. So, okay, we disagreed a little bit on that, but we got over it. We continue to correspond and get together over the years. We met many times, almost every year. This is one memorable time when we were together. This is from the TELUS World of Science in Edmonton. And I think my notes have us as 2008 that we met here. And TELUS, for those you don't know, it was a major broadcasting company, just started to make inroads. And the Edmonton Space Science Center, which is very UFO-ish in appearance, was launching a special new series. They had just brought in a digital planetarium projector, and they brought in a lot of speakers to talk about unusual things, including UFOs. And so we both ended up on the same podium. And this is my beautiful wife who was along with me for the ride, and you'll see her a little bit later as well. But she was helping man the huckster tables, selling books and paraphernalia. Here we are on the podium at the TELUS World of Science. The fellow standing up there is named Frank Florian. He's still the director of the Edmonton Space Science Center, TELUS World of Science. And it was very well attended, a very large crowd. And, it was interesting sharing the podium with Stan because he was such a wealth of knowledge. And I could really talk about what was going on recently, like the UFO cases that were being reported that particular year. So we really played off each other quite a bit. This shot comes from, let me just check here. Oh, MUFON 2009. I think this was in Denver. Again, Stan, typical pose behind the table selling his books and so forth. But what's interesting about this particular event is that Kevin Randall, whom, was not Stan's favorite guy, and I don't think Stan was Kevin's favorite guy either, but they were appearing on the same stage as with me. The fellow far to the right there is Frank Salisbury, a very prominent ufologist who did a lot of research on some particular cases in the United States. But you'll notice that at this point, Stan and Kevin are sort of the body language is, they're talking, they're civil, they're on stage, they're in public. So I took it upon myself to get between the two of them, because we're all chums, and Stan had no trouble with this, but it doesn't look like Kevin had a good time at that. Frank was enjoying himself immensely. He was a wonderful man. This is another time when Stan, this was actually comes from the opening photo. You can see the chair and light in the back. This is from Paracon 2012, I believe. And this one, I was not speaking. This was an event where Stan was speaking, and Don and I traveled just to spend time with them because we'd become good friends over the years. And we visited him in his hotel room. And one of the things that I began doing while talking to individuals at various conferences and so forth is interviewing them on particular topics and posting the interviews. And at this particular Paracon, I, just took it upon myself to ask Stan a few questions.
I'm here at Paracon with Stanton Friedman, and Stan and I go back a number of years, chatting with UFOs and all the things that go along with it. And I have a couple of questions. And the first question is, well, not really a question. If a skeptic or a debunker or just someone in the general public says, Stan, you've been wasting your time with all this UFOs or real stuff, how do you react to that?
I say they don't know what they're talking about. If they read my books, they'll find out that there's an enormous amount of material that most people are unaware of, especially the skeptics. And that enlarge people's view of where we fit in the universe, not only about flying saucers, but about the bigger picture. So I don't feel that I've been wasting my time at all. That sometimes it's a waste of time to talk to people whose minds are closed, but that's their problem, not mine.
Okay. Second question is, what about the whole Roswell thing? You've been at the Roswell. You're one of the original investigators of it. The original investigator of Roswell. After all this time, is there anything still left to be found? Is there something that can be found out about Roswell at this point?
Well, I hope so. The problem is that there's no question that there's a huge volume of classified material that we've never seen. Analysis of the wreckage, analysis of the bodies, reports of who went where, all that sort of thing, military kind of stuff. Reports from the people who led the troops who recovered wreckage, who guarded bodies, etc. Now, obviously, most of the original people are gone, 65 years.
Right.
But there is a written record. And, I've been to 20 archives. There's an awful lot of old stuff that you can't get access to because it's still classified. Some people think it's automatically
even after 65 years.
Yeah, sure. And so, I'm hopeful sometime maybe somebody on his deathbed will say, I kept a couple of reports out and you can have them. That would be nice.
Yeah, that would be nice. And I think some of us are still hoping for that. But that was a fairly typical interview. I mean, we're talking shop, basically. And I just wanted to capture some of this for posterity. So I did a number of these, and I'll show you a few more a little bit later. This is another event that we were at. Here's Stan actually holding one of my books for a change. And at another conference, Stan was on stage with Travis Walton as hearkening back from last time. And we all went for dinner and had a good time. I did an interview with Travis as well. It was interesting to see all these interactions with other ufologists, with other figures from ufology. And yet there was something missing. There was something lacking. Because we have all these great interviews and there's many clips of Stan talking about UFOs that we could bring up, and many are going to be in the Fredericton Fonds, but there's something missing. And for me, I wanted to know about Stan himself. And as I said, we'd become friends. He used to talk to me about his family, about his kids, he was a human being, and most people didn't get a chance to see that or experience that. So I wanted to figure out a way to convey that as part of this presentation and series. So one thing I wanted to do is play a clip, and I have to move this out of the way here, of the personal side of ufology, because I wanted to know from Stan, what was it like being a ufologist?
Stan, here's a question that's kind of about ufology, but not really. How is your being involved in UFOs and the study of reports and government investigations and so forth, how's that impacted your family and your life?
It's impacted them a lot in the sense that I'm gone a lot. I sometimes do a lot of late night radio programs, which is kind of noisy around that, right, so to speak. My time commitments, I have to spend a lot of time not only with the media, but traveling and writing books and stuff like that. So it's dominated my life. On the other hand, my wife isn't interested in this subject.
Not at all.
As far as I can tell, I'm not even sure she's read my books. She wants to be sure the bills can be paid.
That's fair.
And we've had, I think, 4 trips. Once we went down to Washington, so she and my daughter could visit the museum and stuff while I was speaking at a MUFON conference. We went to Hawaii. That was nice. And so we had a few days. I had a lecture out there. And if people didn't want me to do anything other than lecture, so fine. So we enjoyed Hawaii. That was good. Once to Las Vegas, which is always,
well, you have to do that, yeah.
Yeah. But otherwise, she doesn't care about going with me. And she worries about me having enough shirts to travel with. That's about the size of it, since I'm still necktying it and stuff like that, But it has affected our schedules, my schedule. But I'm in a peculiar situation. My wife is one of 9 kids. They're all still alive. And 6 of them live in Fredericton. So she has a social life that's dependent on family. And doesn't need me as part of that.
Husbands would only be in the way anyways.
Yes. Right.
Let Stan go off and do his thing about those pesky flying saucers.
Yes. It's about the size.
Thanks.
Okay, well, there's a side of Stan that you probably didn't see very often. Yeah, it affects your family. In fact, I can speak from experience that my wife doesn't roll her eyes as much anymore when there's a TV crew coming in the door, but it happens. I mean, it's this type of thing that happens. And she's fantastic. She's my biggest supporter, and she encourages me, and she's a big help. And my kids are less supportive. I think that's the best way to phrase it. But they're curious. They're very curious, and they're fascinated by the fact that Dad is doing his thing again. So there's and ufology takes its toll. And at the end of the day, it takes some very interesting tolls, and we reflect on what ufology is really all about and what we are doing has an impact, or does it? So I asked Stan the question that I have been ruminating about for some time, and he answered it.
Regrets? I've had a few. How about you? Yeah, there are times when I wish I hadn't spent so much time, money, effort, family time digging into the facts about flying saucers.
Really? You regret that?
But some of that was probably overdone because people aren't paying attention anyway.
I guess. Well,
and because I was denying my family my presence and my mental approval of what they were doing, looking at them. So that's kind of a regret.
I hear that. That's important. I mean, you're balancing family with your passion, and that's certainly going to cause some issues.
Yeah, and it has. And I worry about that. But okay, I can't change the past. What I can do is change the future. And I realize I'm running out of steam. I'm getting old. My memory isn't as good as it used to be. Maybe I should be cutting back on the travels, which are difficult. These days, traveling isn't fun, as you know. I mean, it's a pain in the neck a good deal of the time. And then the question is, where are we going to go from here? What good does it do anyway? So it will be interesting to see the reaction to the new book that Kathleen Morgan did.
Right.
fact, fiction, and flying saucers, and it's a frontal attack on the antics of Phil Glass, of Ed Condon, of Donald Menzel, making people aware that there have been evil powers, if you will, throwing monkey wrenches into the business and lying. That's what bugs me. It's the lying. There may be differences of opinion about some things, but when it's flat out lying and stupidity, how could Ed Condon, who was a brilliant physicist, I say that, I'm a member of the American Physical Society and the American Nuclear Society, say something like, we can't expect there to be alien life visiting here for 10,000 years. What kind of nonsense is that? There's no basis for that. Menzel I can understand better because of his secret ties to the intelligence community, and they were much. There was an awful lot of it. Now, Glass was evil right from the start. That is, he lied all over the place. He falsely attacked. Now, I wish I could prove that he was working for somebody, but I haven't been able to do that. I'm not too surprised at that. I talked to somebody from Aviation Week in Space Technology and when they found out that one of their people had connections to the CIA going back to the Church Committee stuff, where it turned out hundreds of journalists had connections with the CIA, were reporting to them on things going on in the room. I found out that when Aviation Week found out that one of their people, my class, had such connections, they fired him. So he certainly would have drawn in his horns, not to make it obvious if he had any connections. But there has to be some reason for a guy who wasn't stupid to take the actions he did, to say the stupid things that he said. And, I still don't understand why Ed Condon did. Ed Condon and Menzel worked together. And I don't know whether Condon knew about Menzel's connections with the intelligence community or not. I think the NSA is an important part of the intelligence community. But when I find that people haven't checked the facts again, listen to these guys, speak nonsense. That's what it boils down to. So that's in the new book, and I'm pleased that we got that out there. I don't know what the response will be. It's too soon. But I think that a very important aspect of what's happened is that the public is far more accepting of the reality of other life from elsewhere now than they used to be 10 years, 5 years, 20 years ago, certainly. And hopefully that's getting a lot of people to thinking, what does it mean, religion-wise, all the other things? These are not trivial questions. And I think one of the reasons the government's been reluctant to put the stuff out on the table is that they've been afraid of what the ramifications would be. The religious people go crazy when people say, hey, the government's been lying to us for 70 years, isn't that terrible? Throw out the bombs, who knows what they're worried about. Maybe they have a secret message from the aliens that says by 5 years from now, the aliens are going to take over the planet, or they know something like that. I don't know. What's the point of telling us that we can't do anything about it anyway? So I don't know. But what concerns me, in one quick sentence, is that the presence of aliens is of concern to governments interacting with each other, and those interactions are not very nice right now. The world is in an upheaval. We need to grow up, and I've seen no signs of our growing up. That's for sure.
Indeed. That's for sure. That was 2016 at Paracon, one of the Paracons, and he was frank. He had regrets. And you might have caught some of that, are we doing any good? Is it doing any good? He was disappointed with a lot of the classic figures in ufology, very critical of the debunkers and the skeptics. And he had some thoughts on the state of the world. And it's so relevant even today. Can you just imagine 2016 and back then talking about, we need to grow up. And this was the last time that I got together with Stan. This was at the International UFO Congress, which I think also was 2016. Our schedules just never seemed to mesh after that. And he looked a little tired there. In fact, he was noticeably a little slower then. He was winding down. And, you know, in the previous clip, he himself talked about how he was getting old and slower, and his memory was going and so forth. But he kept on because his passion continued. And so all I can say is that Stan is missed, but his legacy lives on. And it's a very, very good thing that the Fredericton Region Museum is working on his fonds, preserving his many papers, his voluminous output of papers and faxes and letters and so forth. A very unique, very, very unique person. And Stan, I miss you too.
Wow.
And so,
Thank you,
Harold,
Chris.
I turn this over to you for questions if anybody has, but that's my personal reminiscence of Stan. You know, because I was looking back, I met him, as I said, sometime in the 70s, late 70s. So, you know, we had a lot of time to chat.
Chris, thank you so very much about that. I got to admit, I was really fascinated. I had not heard that UFO, the 747 guy said 6 times the size of a 747 tracked on radar at 8,300 kilometers an hour. Jeepers, it would take a hike out of any pilot to have something that big anywhere near you that was not being controlled by anybody that you knew about there.
Absolutely. And just, you know, to recap, I mean, I just happened to be in the National Research Council, in the Hertzberg Institute of Astrophysics, in the non-meteoric sightings file department, when a teletype came in with that. I copied it down because I couldn't take the teletype, as much information as I could, and then tried to get a hold of him, and then contacted Stan, who was able to contact him, and then got the case that way. Otherwise, we might not have heard much about this particular instance.
Well, I do want to get to some of the questions. There are quite a few here in the chat line. So to start with, I'm going to run through some of those, and then when we see the hands, we'll get to them. Okay, running back up here. Oh, jeepers, more questions coming in. Bear with me. Okay, from the very beginning. Chris, what are your thoughts on the legitimacy of the Majestic 12 documents? Was Mr. Friedman able to find evidence of them that we should be looking for more closely at? And that's from Jason Carradine.
I think I've always been troubled by the Majestic 12 documents, and I think there's enough red flag to suggest that something funny was going on there. I asked Stan a couple of times, you know, about the circumstances, and is it possible that one of the important documents was planted? And in fact, he admitted himself that one of the documents was sort of in between 2 files in this particular box. And in the archives that particular one was in, Stan explained how they're very careful about people leaving with stuff. They don't want people to take things out of the archive, but they weren't as careful about people bringing things in. So if you had a notebook, you could bring it in, and it could have been possible to slip something in and then actually place something in the archive as a red herring.
Yeah.
And so I have a lot of trouble with the you know, with the documentation itself. And Stan used to call it his gray basket. I know he spent a lot of time in many archives going through things, and he was much more expert at going through archives than myself. But I find a lot of the circumstances around the documents themselves rather troubling. You know, there's on a photographic reel and slipped in a package in a mail slot and so forth. There's just a lot of issues that I find you know, a little troubling.
The next one I've got is, Melinda would like to know what Stanton thought of your work on the Falkland Lake incident.
Stan and I only talked about Falcon Lake from time to time. I don't think he ever spoke to the witness. No, I'm fairly certain he never spoke to the witness. But he was very impressed with the amount of documentation. And, you know, Stan was all about paper. And we had a lot of paper on the Falcon Lake case. In fact, somewhere around 300 separate pages of documents from the government on the Falcon Lake case, from the RCMP, from the RCAF, and so forth. And he said, I remember him looking at some of the documents that I was showing him. We would trade off documents sometimes. And he said, yeah, there's no question that something happened, because, I mean, this was a government investigation of a real UFO case. They called it a UFO. And the government itself said that they didn't have an explanation for the case. So Stan was actually very impressed with the case, no question.
And of course, the fellow who, you can imagine somebody walking up to a jet fighter on the runway and reaching out to touch the exhaust to see if it was hot. This guy, again, he was a prospector. He was curious, but he went up and he touched this thing and he got badly burned. I don't know what you would want to make up a story that would be far-fetched when you're going to the hospital, but he had those peculiar round circles all over him kind of thing there. He was injured by this. Now, again, it was perhaps a not too swift move to go up and touch it. But again, no reason to disbelieve it based on the number of reports in the investigation into it.
Mm-hmm. And we even have the medical records, not only from the emergency room, but also from his family doctor. So, you know, there's a lot of evidence that for that particular case.
Now, Murray asks, Stanton was obviously driven to pursue the investigation of UFOs. Did he ever share with you that moment where it became his lifelong passion? Did he tell you that? Bing.
Oh. Not, I'm trying to think now. Did he tell me about the ping? I know when he got the book, and I think it was Ruppelt's book.
Somebody put him on to Roswell saying that Barzell and Jesse Marcello were alive at the time and told the story, and it intrigued him. But it was after that, at some point, where he got the aha moment.
Yeah, it was sometime after that. I think, again, and I think it has something to do with that once he spoke with Barzell, that I think, or Marcel, maybe it was Marcel.
I think it was Marcel.
Marcel, yeah, Marcel that he spoke with. I think the fact that he said, you know, this actually has something to it now. You know, we have all these rumors. Here's somebody who was actually there. That might have been the moment.
Yeah. I mentioned earlier on, for those who may not be aware, not to shoot my own turn, as an int guy, every so often you get tasked by the people you work for to give a cover story. You know it isn't true, but for the greater good and to protect people, you have to do that. And the specific incident I use is there was an extreme terrorist we wanted to catch. We knew he was in Paris, and we asked the newspaper people here in Canada to state that he'd been seen and was being chased in Montreal. When the guy heard about that over there, he came out of his hiding place in Paris and we got him. Now, again, we knew the story was false. We told the people that it was false with the newspapers. They cooperated with us to catch the bad guy. So Jesse was caught in that same situation where he knew what he discovered, a truckload of parts, and that they didn't have the actual craft. That happened in a different location. But he knew it wasn't a weather balloon, but his bosses felt that people were going to get scared and it had to be covered up, and he was ordered to give the story of the balloon. And he had to follow it through. You get these jobs, that's part of the life. I think Stanton was convinced that there was an awful lot more of that going on than anybody realized, including the participants.
Yeah.
Now, question from Sally. Did Stanton show more or less interest in Canadian UFO reports, or was he interested in them all no matter where they were reported?
Well, that's a good question. I have to say he didn't seem as interested in Canadian cases. I mean, he was American, and, you know, he came up to Fredericton for family reasons, and his knowledge of Canadian cases was really not that significant. In fact, I remember talking to him about the Warren Smith photo case from Calgary, which he had never heard of at the point where I was talking with him about it. So I think he didn't have a great grasp of the Canadian scene, and he was fascinated when I started producing the annual survey, and he was always promoting that. And in fact, he used some of the data in some of his lectures and some of his slides. So he knew about Shag Harbor and Falcon Lake and a few others, but in general, I don't think he had an encyclopedic knowledge of Canadian cases for sure.
Yeah. Raquel has asked that, or says that she heard him speak and asked him about the Men in Black. He said that he kept his focus strictly on UFOs because he was fighting to be taken seriously, and he was concerned that discussing those phenomena would undermine his efforts to bring the UFO research into the light and past the laughter curtain. She's curious as to what he really thought about that and how he felt about your research into Sasquatch.
Oh, well, just about Men in Black, I mentioned his gray basket, as he called it, and he had a lot of things in there. And he focused his energy on Roswell and some document retrieval and so forth, because those were things that he knew a lot about. And he didn't have he didn't research into Men in Black, so he didn't really want to comment on them. He knew about the fact that my first and second books were sort of about Fortean phenomena in general, which was UFOs, Sasquatch, lake monsters, and paranormal phenomena. I actually started in ufology as a Fortean, interested in all this, because what happened was I was investigating one particular UFO case and talking to a farmer who had seen this, and I said, has anything else unusual happened in this particular area? And he said, well, if you want to consider the Sasquatch that was seen last night over just down the road. And so I thought, well, maybe there's something to this then, out of curiosity. So I started collecting reports of that. And then when I was investigating, gathering information for one of my books about Sasquatch, somebody said, well, do you want to know about lake monsters in Canada? Yeah. And so that's started that. So I looked upon it as more of a historical enterprise, that this is what actually was being reported. And I was approaching it in the same way as I did UFOs. What was seen? What's the person's experience? Can you give an accurate description? Is there any evidence? And approaching it as you would any other discipline. And I don't go off speculating about Bigfoot being aliens' pets that they let out for a walk when they land or anything like that. And there are books like that, by the way, just so you know. But I find it fascinating as part of a human experience, that people are having these remarkable experiences. And in fact, my second book was titled Unnatural History. This is not the natural history. This is the unnatural history. And because I wasn't making any outlandish claims, as a science writer, I find it fascinating.
I would have to mention to our public, after one of the last sessions we had, I received a phone call from a person I know fairly well who talked about his experience with Men in Black. And I thought, well, okay, I've heard, I'm sure some of you have heard of these people. They're all black, very pale skin, sunglasses even at night, dark hats, wires coming out of their arms and pant legs. That's the story of the Men in Black that you read about. But what he was talking about was an aircraft crash. 4-engine aircraft went down out west. And after the crash, they could find no physical determinate reason why the aircraft went down. But they had picked up a radar reading of some large object in the same vicinity. And the concern was that it may have been a Russian drone coming into North American aerospace. And so the Men in Black were actually military people in black flight suits, and perhaps other agencies and organizations coming in to investigate if this had been some kind of Russian interference with this aircraft. And that's what he meant by Men in Black. And I thought that sounded a little more reasonable. If you're seeing people investigating a crash and there's no explicable reason for it, and UFOs have been part of the research of the reporting, it would not be unreasonable to think that people would come to investigate. And again, I know for many years when I was with the military, I wore a black flight suit for demonstrations and things. So that made a lot of more sense to me. But however, the next question there are two of them. One, did he meet the fellow that from the Falkland Lake incident? I think you said no. And the next question from John was, can you tell us about your involvement in the Falkland Lake incident?
Sure. We could spend easily a couple of lectures this length just talking about it. Basically, this fellow he was actually an engineer, and he was doing some amateur prospecting. He was a rock hound in this particular area, was looking for some interesting rocks, and he saw, for all intents and purposes, a Hollywood-style flying saucer land on a rock outcropping not far away. He watched it for a while, got brave. He thought it was some sort of American secret flying machine, thought perhaps it was an early version of the Apollo capsule, because this was just the beginning of Apollo. In fact, I think Apollo 1 had just occurred, that tragedy. And he thought it was American, so he walked up and shouted out, hey, you Americans, I'll give you a hand fixing your broken down flying machine. And he went up to the side of it and he poked his head in this little door, and there were lights coming out, but he had touched the side of it when he was bracing his head as he looked in. And his rubberized glove melted. A blast of gas came out of this thing when the thing took off, setting fire to his clothes and the pine needles and the leaves. And he eventually was treated in hospital. My involvement was that I knew his son. In fact, the book, which you can see right over here, that I wrote with his son, because when we were kids, about 10 years old or so, we used to hang out together, and one day I went over to hang out with him. He says, I can't, something happened to my dad. And I'd forgotten about that. I wasn't all that interested back then. But when I got into astronomy and started investigating, I knew, hey, I know somebody who saw a UFO. And because I still knew the family, they invited me into their inner circle, and they had refused interviews, but they took me under their wing. I knew the family quite well. Unsolved Mysteries flew myself and them down to their set with NBC to film Unsolved Mysteries. Worked with them many times on a number of projects. They entrusted with me all their things, like the card. He went down to the Mayo Clinic for being studied by the doctors down there. There was radiation found at the site. In fact, we recently tested a piece which we still have at a university. It's still radioactive. And the very protracted story, fascinating, but as I mentioned, there's 300 pages of documentation, the interrogation of the RCMP officers in the area, the hotel operator, the maid, the cleaning lady who was working on the hotel where he was staying. It's a whole series of things. It's a very fascinating case, and I encourage people to read more about it. We've written about it many times.
There was a follow-up question from Chris. Did you ever any success finding a second witness to that case?
No, there was never a second witness to that. There are people who've come forward. One of the reasons we went on Unsolved Mysteries was to get more witnesses. We did 2 shows with Unsolved Mysteries, and there are a lot of tips, but no witness came forward. However, in the intervening years, people had come forward to say that they had actually, they were in the area at the time, or about the same time, they couldn't pin down the date, and saw something in the sky that sounded a little bit similar. So there's no actual witness to that particular case, but there were people who had seen things about the same time.
I have a question.
Yes, Murray?
Okay. Hi. Sorry, it's not fully formed. Chris, have you recently had a conversation or debate with all the buzz about the discovery of exoplanets and that sort of circle of people, and SETI types versus the other type? I'm putting them in different camps, right? So has there been, like, even on a stage or a dialogue with people who go, sure there's life out there, but not UFOs, right? So, like, if you had those kinds of conversations.
Well, there are some conversations going on behind the scenes. You may have seen the news report that was just last week of a Harvard professor named Avi Loeb, who believed that this piece of space debris that flew through our solar system called Oumuamua was actually an alien probe. And he firmly believes that there should be a concerted effort to study, the solar system and other parts of the galaxy for evidence that aliens are visiting us and so forth. And he formed this thing called the Galileo Project, which consists of mostly academics, academic researchers from all across various, astrobiologists, engineers, and so forth, to participate in the search for extraterrestrial intelligence. The idea there might be some alien probes in orbit around Earth right now. Maybe there's some that had, they're buried on the moon or something like that, and examining the skies using telescopes and so forth. And one of the things that was missing from the Galileo project was recognition. Well, two things. One was a recognition that the CD program has been doing exactly the same thing for many years. And the other thing was that even though he talked about unidentified aerial phenomena, UAPs, there was never any recognition that ufology has played a part in this whatsoever. And how, what about all the UFO cases that are on record, that some of which may in fact show some alien life, according to some individuals. And what's happened that actually only within the past several days is that he's brought on what he's called affiliates. And these include some people from the UFO community. In fact, some people from the Scientific Coalition for Ufology, some people involved in UAPX, and so forth. And in fact, somebody from Dalhousie University is listed as an affiliate as well. He's apparently in the Department of Psychology, as I understand it. I'm trying to remember his name, Tariq Musaf or something like that. Anyways, he's never had anything to do with ufology as I can tell, but he's something to do with the Galileo Project as an affiliate looking into unidentified aerial phenomena. So there's a Canadian connection, the only Canadian connection with this. And it's interesting that, we have this renewed interest. In fact, the UAP task force acknowledged that the scientific community has been instrumental in getting the public and getting congressional interest a little higher into UFOs. And they said the scientific community is going to be very important in moving forward. And the Galileo Project may be one of these, although, it seems strange that it's almost all academic and they're going to be using telescopes when ufology has all these cases and people in the field doing investigations already. So they probably should rely a little bit more on those. So it'll be interesting to see where this goes. But there's no question that the search for extraterrestrial life is very, very important. And the question plays very prominently into ufology.
Thank you.
Chris, thank you for your question, Murray. Chris, do you find it alarming as to why doesn't Canada have a UAP task force like the USA does? That comes from Jason.
Yeah, it is actually interesting that we don't have a UAP task force, although in the United States, UFOs fell under the domain of defense and security, under the Air Force and now the Navy and so forth, and the Pentagon. In Canada, we've had a pretty good record. We're somewhat more transparent in that at one point, the Royal Canadian Air Force did investigate UFOs. They handed the whole thing off to the National Research Council with the assistance of the RCMP, which investigated up till 1995. And then Transport Canada sort of took this on, and we have pilots reporting UFOs to Transport Canada, not UAPs, actually Transport Canada calls them UFOs right now. And we continue to get UFO reports through Transport Canada and the National Defense all the time. So we're actually a little more transparent, but there's no concerted effort. And perhaps we'll see something come. And I think once the 90-day, I think there's a report, a 90-day report after the UAP task force briefing that's coming out, and then another one. And I think we'll see some interest from other countries and probably Canada as well, because that's what happened in the 1960s, where Lester Pearson was asked a question in the House of Commons about UFOs, because there were some UFOs that were being seen. He asked Defense to start taking a look into what's going on, and that started this whole connecting with the National Research Council. So there might be something that's going to be showing up.
Glenn, I'd like to know what you think Stanton would have thought of the recent Pentagon report.
I think he would say, "I told you so," because
I have to agree. Yes.
He wouldn't have been surprised at all. I think that's the short answer. I saw Chris Stiles' hand up. Is he before the what you got there, Harold?
I don't have a Chris. If you want to ask a question, could you turn your mic on?
Can you hear me now?
Yes, I can.
Hi, Chris. Great presentation, by the way. I just wanted to bounce something off you and kind of get your reaction to it here. One of the very few things that Stanton and I used to argue about was MJ12.
Mm-hmm.
And the first time it come up, this is going to sound almost hard to believe, I was the guest to a very bad movie with not a very great guest, which was Phil Klass. I was in Greensboro, North Carolina, and the movie Independence Day had just been released. And we went to see it. Just afterwards, he wanted to buy supper or something like that. What an experience. So we went. He was trying to be gracious because he liked my presentation there and was actually somewhat charming, let's say. Anyway, when I saw Stanton later on, I mentioned to him, he rolled his eyes, right? And I said, the movie raised an interesting question, and class couldn't stop laughing. And it was this, that in the character of the president, I believe, was played by actor Bill Pullman.
Mm-hmm.
And at some point when the invasion begins and the nation and the world is shocked, he asks his aides, how come I didn't know about this, that there are aliens on Earth and that we knew that as a given certain fact? And his aides tell him, sir, we're very sorry, but you don't have sufficient security clearance. So I remember asking Stanton, could that possibly be how it worked? And he responded reasonably by saying, well, I don't see how that would work or to sustain or carry on, because presidents can fire heads of the intelligence agencies and install who he wants. So then I asked the one that got his ire between him and me. It was the only thing we ever argued about. I raised the issue of Roscoe Hillenkoetter.
Mm-hmm.
And specifically, I said, listen, so if you could shield the president from, let's just say that concept is valid. I said, and this is being withheld and controlled and passed down through basically civil servants and the intelligence community in the US. I said, let's go back to 1947. Roscoe Hillenkoetter is installed in that position before the Roswell incident. In fact, before the so-called modern UFO era. And he had an illustrious military career, served in the highest positions, reached the rank of vice admiral. He was the first director of CIA, and of course, a purported member of MJ12.
Right.
And by 1960, he had retired. He sat on the board of directors with NICAP, gave interviews, wrote letters to Congress, calling out for disclosure on UFOs, complained that perhaps the Air Force was sitting on it, and gave numerous interviews with broadsheets like the New York Times. Well, even if the president was judged unworthy to know or not having a sufficient security clearance, if anybody would have known, wouldn't it have been Roscoe Hillenkoetter?
Yeah, you'd think Roscoe would have known. Absolutely. as far as clearance goes, I can tell you here that I had a request from a member of Parliament to brief him on UFOs about a month ago. And in the course of discussion, I found out that the Minister of Defense, his or herself, actually doesn't have the highest clearance. In fact, if there was a task force on UFOs in existence in Canada, and it was classified very high, even the Minister of Defense probably wouldn't have known about it.
It's called compartmentalization. If you don't need to know, you don't know.
Exactly.
And if you do need to know, you're one of very few who do.
Yeah. So I wouldn't be surprised if that was going on widely in other countries. But you're right. I think Helen Cutter and a few other would be
like if he didn't know, and his attempt to call out and encourage the public for disclosure on UFOs seemed quite genuine. You know, and there were people that knew him personally, such as Dick Hall, which at the time was still alive, and who I worked with, you know, with the Fund for UFO Research to get backing. You know, I mean, you know, he was at one point second in command at NICAP, you know, and he had been a former classmate, you know, of Hillencoder's and that, and he thought it was all quite genuine. So if anybody would have known, it should have been him, and he apparently did not appear to.
Yeah.
Which brings great questions to me in the whole.
There's a lot of questions out there.
Disclosure thing, like of something I'm not in that camp of thought. At the same time, I'd be the first thing the government does know a little more than it's saying.
Oh, absolutely.
A lot of the time.
Which is to also remember, this was the era of Kim Philby, a British spy who in the days of the Spanish Civil War thought that the Russians were the good guys, that they joined Britain in fighting Hitler. And so he decided he was going to work for the Russians. And he was so damn good at it that they put him on exchange in the United States in their intelligence organizations, and got away with it. And now he's a 2-star general in Russia, or he's dead long since passed. But once bitten, twice shy. There's the compartmentalization thing. People at the top don't know everything. No one person knows everything. Guys say, I've got all the clearances in the world. No, you don't. You do not have a need to know, therefore you don't have the clearance for it. And if you do have the clearance for it, there's a very few people who do. So it's entirely possible that this person at the highest rank level did not have the clearance to see or hear about the information that he was aware. And I have a feeling he must have been aware that it was there, or he wouldn't have raised the question.
Yeah.
He knew there was something to it, which means that he had his ear to the ground. But what? Who knows?
Right. Yeah.
I'm not seeing any more hands up. Do you have another question, Chris Stiles?
No, I'll just close with just telling Chris that how I appeased Stanton and got him to calm down was I told him that I thought I'd found the evidence that Edward Euler Condon was in fact a Soviet mole. and
entirely possible.
And I did believe that. In fact, you know, Richard Nixon, you know, that's a matter of history, did try to have him prosecuted with that, have to prove that, right? And in the years since, you know, it's been clear that all the ones that they have caught or found the evidence for later on the Manhattan Project, of which Condon was part of, right?
Right.
One of the telling things was that the Soviet code names for them always reflected the person's specialty. And at the time, one of the few they did not catch was somebody whose code name was Quantum. And at that time, Condon was one of the few people in the world who had co-written one of the very few textbooks on quantum mechanics. So yeah, but and the reason he probably wasn't caught is he actually didn't work at the site in the desert. He worked on the centrifuge problem in California, right?
But if they caught him,
I have a lot of the paperwork. Anyway, we'll end it there. But Stanton was so happy to hear that, and I never got a chance to show him. That was in 2018, and that was our last argument and our last makeup, and it was all a pleasure. And there you go.
Thank you, Chris, and thank you, Chris. Well, I'm going to call an end to it there, ladies and gentlemen. How extraordinary. Well, first of all, thank you, everyone for coming together tonight, and especially thanks to Chris for making the 5th presentation in the Stanton Friedman Memorial Speaker Series. If you have any questions that you can always contact us at the Fredericton Region Museum and by email and so on. And again, we have a website and a Facebook site. Have a look. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. It looks like we've got a regular fan base, and I think we're going to have to do this again this time next year when things settle down. Have a good evening, everyone, and good night.
Dark star in the night, glowing, moving into sight. Engines pulsing as you land. Bright star gonna make a stand.